Well, hello. Thanks for reading with me today. Today we're reading from the book of Acts, chapter 18. Acts, chapter 18. As I've been doing in these studies, I've been trying to show how the New Testament documents fit together, particularly focusing on the Apostle Paul and his travels and the letters which he is writing as he's traveling from one place to another. Just trying to show how the New Testament books all fit together. Some of those books fit within the time frame of the book of Acts. Some of them do not. And so as we're going along in our Bible reading, I'm just trying to all along explain how these books all fit together. And I'm going to continue that in our video today as we think about Acts chapter 18. Now, let's start in Acts chapter 17. Now, we've just finished reading the two Thessalonian letters together. Now, let's talk a little bit about where those letters actually fit. Those two letters were written from the city of Corinth. Paul was in the city of Corinth. And you say, well, wait a minute. We haven't been to Corinth yet in the book of Acts. And that's right. We're reading about Paul's first trip to Corinth today. Acts chapter 18. In Acts 18 and in verse 1, Paul leaves Athens and goes to Corinth. And it's actually in Acts chapter 18 and verse 5 that Paul is going to write the Thessalonian letters. So why did I place the reading of the two Thessalonian letters between Acts 17 and 18? Well, two reasons. One of them I've mentioned to you before. This reading schedule that I've put together is not precise to the very verse, all right? I simply didn't have enough room on the document, on the paper, to put in the precise locations of every single book. So I've gotten it as close as I could by effectively rounding to the nearest chapter. Okay, maybe that would be a good way to say it. And the second reason is because Paul visited Thessalonica in Acts 17. And so because of proximity to his visit, as is recorded in the book of Acts, it made sense to put the two Thessalonian letters there. But let's talk a little bit about the precise fitting of the Thessalonian letters to the city of Corinth where Paul was. So let's start in Acts chapter 17. Now, we've talked some about Acts 17 already. How when Paul went to Thessalonica, in verse 1 of chapter 17, verses 1 through 9, details what happened to them in Thessalonica. They had considerable success in that city, but they also had considerable opposition from the Jews who didn't believe. And those Jews began a persecution. And that persecution rose to a point that Paul and Silas and Timothy had to leave town. So in Acts 17 and in verse 10, it says, the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. Now they go down to Berea and they have good success there as well. But those same Jews from Thessalonica heard that Paul and Silas went down to Berea and they were preaching down there. And so those Jews said, well, we need to go down to Berea and start doing the same thing there, persecuting there. And that's what they did. And so in Acts chapter 17 and verse 14, immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remained there. So Paul leaves Berea. Silas and Timothy do not. They stay there. Now verse 15. Those who escorted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they left. All right, so here's what's happening. Paul leaves Berea. He goes down to Athens by himself. But he says to Silas and Timothy, apparently he sends word back to them and says, come down to Athens and meet me. So Paul in chapter 17 and verse 16, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, all right, waiting for Silas and Timothy to come down. And apparently they do. Turn over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. 1 Thessalonians 3 gives us another layer here, another layer of information. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 talks about these travels and these things that happen between Paul and Silas and Timothy. So in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 1, therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you as to your faith, so that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we have been destined for this. So apparently, Timothy and Silas made it down to Athens. They reconnect with Paul down there, and Paul and Silas send Timothy up to Thessalonica. Now, here's where Silas disappears. We don't know exactly what Silas does next. We don't know exactly where he goes. Timothy, obviously, goes to Thessalonica. But it doesn't say anything about Silas going with him. Now, we do know, however, from Acts 18 and verse 5, that Silas did go to Macedonia, which is where Thessalonica was. But also, that's the region, Macedonia, where Philippi was. Maybe Silas went back to Philippi to check on them. We don't exactly know what city or what church Silas went to, but he did go along with Timothy up into Macedonia. Timothy went to Thessalonica, Silas presumably went somewhere else. But Acts chapter 18 and verse 5 mentions both Silas and Timothy came down to Corinth from Macedonia, and they met Paul there in Corinth. But from Athens, Silas, Timothy, and Paul are there together, and it is decided that Timothy and Silas are going to travel up to Macedonia. Timothy goes to Thessalonica, and again, we don't know where Silas went, other than he went into Macedonia. Now, in 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 6, now that Timothy has come to us from you, and has brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always think kindly of us, and so forth, Timothy returns from Thessalonica, meets Paul in Corinth with an encouraging report about the church in Thessalonica. Now, if you jump back to Acts 18 and verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, when they came down from Macedonia, Timothy bringing this good, encouraging report from Thessalonica, Silas probably coming from Philippi, Paul then writes the letter, the first letter to the Thessalonians. Here in Acts 18, after verse 5, when Timothy comes back with this good report, Paul writes the Thessalonian letters. Now, I hope that helps you see where 1st and 2nd Thessalonians fit within the framework of Paul's travels and what Silas and Timothy are doing. But there's another element of this that I want to add. Another element as it relates to Silas. Notice in Acts chapter 18, which is where our reading comes from today, verse 1, after these things, so after Paul leaves Athens, he goes to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Paul is making tents along with Aquila and Priscilla. They're all working together, And on the Sabbath day, Paul is in the synagogues trying to persuade the Jews, as well as whatever Greeks he may have come into contact with. Paul is working with his hands to support himself in his preaching. He's not taking money from the people that he's going to convert in the church or in the city of Corinth. But notice, while it mentions early in chapter 18 that he's making tents and has this trade, in verse 5 it says, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Verse 5 indicates that Paul stopped making tents, and he devoted himself completely to teaching and preaching. Now, what was it that enabled him to do that? Look at the book of Philippians. Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. You yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel, after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once for my needs. The church at Philippi made it a priority to support the ministry of the Apostle Paul. They worked hard to make sure that Paul's needs were met because they saw what he was doing in preaching the gospel as vitally important, something that needed to be supported. And Paul says, after I left Philippi, Acts 16, Lydia, the jailer, you remember reading that a couple of weeks ago. After I left Macedonia, after I left Philippi, you gave me support financially. No other church supported me financially. You did that. You met my needs on more than one occasion. Now let's add another detail to this. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and look at verse 8. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 8. Now remember, Acts 18, Paul is in Corinth. And now, later on, Paul writes to the Corinthians, and he talks about when he was in Corinth in Acts 18. So in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 8, he says, I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. In other words, I know he uses the word robbed, and that has a pejorative meaning. He's stealing from other churches. But Paul's using that as kind of a, maybe not sarcasm, but it's not literal either. He's not breaking into a church and taking their money. He's saying, I had to be supported by other churches so that I could work among you. I had to be supported by others so that I could minister to you. I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. And in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you and will continue to do so. So Acts 18 mentions Paul working with his hands, making tents with Aquila and Priscilla. But when Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia, Paul completely devotes himself to teaching the word. Now connect that with these two passages we've just looked at. Paul says to the church in Philippi, you have shared with me from the earliest days after I preached in Philippi, you have supported me financially. And here in 2 Corinthians 11, he says other churches supported me financially so that I could serve you in Corinth. And so what I'm suggesting to you in this is that when Silas and Timothy came back from Macedonia, where they were checking on the churches, when they came to Corinth and they brought these encouraging reports to the Apostle Paul about how the brethren are doing, they didn't just come with reports. They came back with money. They came with funds that were used to support Paul. And it was apparently so much money that Paul didn't any longer have to work with his hands, but now all of his needs could be supplied, and he could fully devote himself to preaching the word. Now let's go back to Acts 18. I'm already at almost 16 minutes here, so I need to finish this video up. I may follow this up with another one because there's just so much that's happening here. But in Acts chapter 18, Paul is going to come to Corinth. Paul is going to be staying here in Corinth. And I just want you to notice in verse 11 that Paul stays for a year and 6 months teaching in Corinth. And here's what I'm going to say about that. Paul has just gone through a pretty wild whirlwind of activity when you go back to chapter 17. Thessalonica, early in chapter 17. Good success, but also tremendous opposition and persecution. He gets run out of town. He goes to Berea. Great success there. But the same persecutors from Thessalonica come down and begin causing problems for him in Berea. He gets run out of town. He goes to Athens by himself, and he is going to have the opportunity to preach at Mars Hill on the Areopagus to all of the leading thinkers of the time. I mean, we're talking Athens, Greece here, the center of Western civilization. This is where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all of these philosophical and cultural giants were. And Paul is in that city, I think, hoping to stay there for a long time. But Paul is effectively dismissed. There were a few people in Athens who believed his preaching, but by and large, Paul was ridiculed and laughed at. And so I get the impression that Paul leaves Athens at a very low place emotionally. Persecuted in Thessalonica, persecuted in Berea. He goes to Athens and is mocked and laughed at by the elitists of the day. And then he comes to Corinth. Last verse we're going to look at today. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. How did Paul come to the city of Corinth? What was his demeanor? What were his expressions? What was his presentation when he came to Corinth? 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And in verse 3, Paul says, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. I think if we reflect on Acts chapter 17 and all of the things that happened to him that led to his arrival in Corinth, it will help us understand why he came to them in weakness and fear and much trembling. I'm not suggesting at all that Paul was somehow unfaithful or doubting God or doubting Christ or anything like that. But what I am suggesting is Paul has been beaten up emotionally in Acts chapter 17. The threat of persecution he faced 2 times. And then at Athens, he's ridiculed. And Paul is probably very down right now, very discouraged right now. And it's no wonder then, back in Acts chapter 18, that when Paul is in Corinth and he begins again to see some Jews who are dismissing him and resisting him, Acts 18 and verse 6 mentions, is it any wonder that Paul, who is in this condition, weakness, fear, trembling, opposition is just continually coming before him, is it any wonder then that in Acts 18 and verse 9, Jesus appears to him, speaks to him in a vision and says, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you in order to harm you, because I have many people in this city." Don't be afraid anymore. Paul, there are many people in this city who will favorably respond to the gospel. You keep preaching. You keep saying what needs to be said, and I will make sure that you are safe and that the gospel spreads in this city. And Paul stays there for a year and a half. Jesus came to encourage Paul when he needed it, and he gave him the strength that he needed to continue on in his ministry and in his effective work for the Lord's cause in Corinth. Thanks for reading with me today. Have a good weekend.